The original blue bloods were not human. What the old world knew for centuries, royal families across Europe called themselves blue bloods. The phrase is so common we never stop to ask why. Why blue? Why not red, or gold, or any other colour that actually fits the human body? The official explanation is that their skin was pale enough to show the veins underneath, and that veins look blue from the outside. That answer is repeated in every history book, in every classroom, in every documentary, and it is one of the laziest cover stories ever written. Because the deeper you dig into the old records, the more you start to see something strange. The phrase did not start with pale skin. It started with bloodlines that claimed they were not the same kind of being as the people they ruled. Different ancestors, different origins, different biology. The peasants were one species, the royals were something else. That was not a metaphor. That was a literal claim, made over and over again in chronicles and family trees that the church and the modern academic system both worked very hard to bury. Today we are going to look at what those old records actually said. We are going to look at the strange anatomy described in royal courts, the forbidden marriages, the mass culling of European royalty during the Reset Wars, the cities and the structures that the so-called blue bloods built before the dates we are told history started. And by the end of this, you are going to understand why the modern world goes to so much trouble to make sure you never ask the obvious question. If you want more videos that take the official story apart piece by piece and show you what is really sitting underneath it, hit subscribe before you go any further. This channel exists to put back what was removed. There are more videos like this one coming every week. You do not want to miss them. Now let us start where the trail starts, not in Europe, but in the records that came out of Europe before Europe was Europe. There was a time, according to dozens of overlapping accounts, when the people who built the great cities of the old world were not the people we now think of as kings and queens. They were taller, they were lighter, their eyes were different, their lifespans were different, and they were referred to in the languages of the time by names that did not translate to human. In the Russian and Slavic chronicles there are repeated references to a class of rulers who came from the north, not from one country in the north, from a region the chronicles describe as the Great Northern Land, a country that no longer appears on any modern map. The chronicles call its people the children of the sky, or the children of the sun, depending on which translator you trust. They were said to have built cities of white stone with copper roofs, and to have ruled vast territories with a single administrative language. They did not have armies the way we think of armies. They had something called the Watchers, who maintained order without ever seeming to fight. When you compare these accounts to the maps that started appearing in Europe in the 1500s and 1600s, something jumps out immediately. The Northern Land is on the maps. It is labelled repeatedly by different cartographers who had no reason to copy each other. The Mercator map of 1595 shows it clearly, a massive continent at the top of the world divided into 4 sections by rivers with a central black mountain. Mercator did not invent this map, he copied it from older sources. Sources he claimed went back to the time before the Bible. Now mainstream geography tells you this was just a misunderstanding. Sailors had not yet explored the Arctic, so they filled in the gaps with imagination. That explanation falls apart the second you look at the dates. The map was drawn before the Arctic was officially explored, yes, but it was drawn with such specific detail, with named rivers and named regions, that the idea of invented geography does not hold up. You do not invent 4 rivers in exact positions and a central mountain by accident. So, who lived there? And what happened to them? The answer that keeps showing up in the old chronicles is that the Northern Land was the original homeland of a ruling class that later spread across the entire planet. When the climate of the north changed, and the chronicles are very specific that it changed suddenly and violently, this ruling class migrated. They went south, they went east, they went west, and everywhere they went they became the founders of the bloodlines that would later be called royal. This is where the phrase blue blood actually begins, not with pale Spanish nobles. with a class of beings whose blood, according to the chronicles, was a different colour than the blood of the people they ruled over. Not metaphorically different, chemically different. The records describe a substance that ran through their veins that was based on copper rather than iron. Copper-based blood, when it oxidizes, turns blue. Iron-based blood, the kind that runs through your veins, turns red. You can stop the video right now and look this up. There are still living creatures on Earth today that have copper-based blood. Horseshoe crabs are the most famous example. Their blood is bright blue when it hits the air. It is so valuable that the pharmaceutical industry harvests it for medical testing because it reacts to bacterial contamination in a way that no other substance does. The biology is real. Blue blood exists. The only question is whether it ever existed in a humanoid body. The old chronicles say yes. They say the original ruling class had this blood and that the trait was passed down through strict marriage rules. You did not marry outside the line. You did not dilute the blood. And the moment a royal child was born without the blue blood trait, that child was removed from the line of succession. Not exiled, removed. Sometimes that meant a quiet life in a monastery. Sometimes it meant something much worse. There is a reason royal genealogies are so obsessive about purity. There is a reason cousin marriages and even closer pairings were not just tolerated but encouraged at the highest levels of European nobility, despite the obvious genetic damage that resulted. The Habsburgs are the textbook example. By the end of their dynasty, their jaw deformities were so severe that some of them could not chew their own food. Charles II of Spain was so genetically compromised that he could barely walk, barely speak, and could not produce children. He died at 38 years old. The official explanation is that the Habsburgs were too proud to marry outside the family. That is the polite version. The real version is that they were trying to preserve something they believed was irreplaceable. They believed that if you let the line dilute, you lost something that could not be recovered. And whether you take the chronicles literally or not, the behavior of these dynasties only makes sense if they thought they were protecting something biological, not just political. Now here is where the story turns dark. There was a period in European history, roughly between the late 1700s and the late 1800s, when the original blue blood dynasties were systematically removed. Not all at once, slowly, through wars, through revolutions, through marriages into outside families, through the rise of new dynasties that did not have the same origin. The French Revolution killed the Bourbons, the Russian Revolution killed the Romanovs, the First World War destroyed the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns. By the end of all this, the original ruling houses of Europe were either gone, in exile, or so diluted that they no longer carried the trait the old chronicles described. The official version of history treats each of these events as a separate thing. A French problem here, a Russian problem there, a German problem somewhere else. But if you step back and look at the timeline as a single event, what you see is a coordinated removal. The old bloodlines were being cleared out one by one in a window of about 120 years, and the people who replaced them, the bankers, the industrialists, the new political class, did not come from the same origin at all. What was being removed? Why was it being removed? And who was doing the removing? The chronicles give you a partial answer, and then they go quiet. They say that the original ruling class had access to knowledge, not magic. Knowledge, specific information about how the world actually worked, where energy came from, how cities could be powered without any of the infrastructure we now consider necessary. They built the cities we now call Old World, the ones with the impossible stonework, the ones with the towers and domes that nobody can replicate with modern construction methods, the ones that show up in old photographs sitting in the middle of supposedly empty American prairies and supposedly primitive African deserts. And here is the part the official story cannot survive. If you look at photographs from the 1850s, the 1860s, the 1870s, of cities in places like Chicago, San Francisco, Melbourne, Bombay, Cape Town, you will see structures of impossible complexity sitting in towns whose populations were supposedly tiny. Cathedrals with stonework that would take 100 modern stonemasons 20 years to produce in cities that the official record says were founded by trappers and missionaries a decade earlier. The math does not work, the labour does not exist, the materials are unaccounted for, and yet there the buildings are in the photographs, finished and standing and apparently in use. The blue blood theory of who built these structures is not just some fringe idea, it is the only theory that accounts for the timeline, because if you accept that there was a previous civilization, ruled by a class of beings who had different biology and different knowledge, who built the cities we now inherit, and who were then removed during the reset period, the photographs suddenly make sense. The buildings were not built in the 1850s, they were already there. The settlers walked into cities that had been built by someone else, claimed them, renamed them, and rewrote the history. This is what the term Tartaria refers to, and this is why mainstream history hates the word so much. Tartaria in the old maps was the largest country on Earth. It covered most of what we now call Russia, Central Asia, Mongolia, parts of China, and arguably much more. It is on the maps, it is in the encyclopedias of the 1700s. The first edition of Encyclopaedia Britannica describes it as a vast empire, and then, sometime in the 1800s, it just disappears from the records. The word is removed, the maps are redrawn, the empire is unmade in the books, even though its cities are still standing on the ground. Who lived in Tartaria? According to the records that survived, it was ruled by the same northern bloodlines we have been talking about. The descendants of the original blue bloods, the ones who carried the copper blood, the ones who built with white stone and copper roofs, the ones who had the knowledge that made the impossible architecture possible. And when Tartaria was erased from the official record, what was actually being erased was the parent civilization, the one that the European royal houses had splintered off from. That is why the timeline of the European resets and the timeline of the disappearance of Tartaria line up so neatly. They were the same event. The removal of the old bloodlines in Europe was the Western Front of a global operation. The destruction of Tartaria was the Eastern Front. By the end of the 1800s, the entire ruling class of the Old World had been removed from power, replaced or absorbed into new dynasties that had no memory of the original system. And the new system did not want anyone to remember. This is why so much effort went into the new educational standards of the late 1800s. The Prussian education model, which became the basis for almost every modern public school system in the Western world, was specifically designed to produce citizens who would not ask the kinds of questions we are asking right now. The curriculum was standardized, the history was simplified, the pre-1800 world was reduced to a handful of names and dates that you could memorize and forget. Everything before that was called the Dark Ages, which is one of the most impressive pieces of marketing ever produced. You take the most architecturally accomplished period in human history and you call it dark. You call its people primitive, you call its records superstition, and then you give yourself permission to ignore everything they wrote. But the records survived. Imperfectly, in pieces, but they survived. And when you start to put them together, the picture that comes out is consistent. There was an older civilization. It was ruled by a class of beings who were not biologically identical to the rest of the population. They built the cities we now inherit. They had access to forms of energy and construction that we no longer understand. And they were removed deliberately in a coordinated operation that took about a century to complete. The phrase blue blood is one of the last surviving fragments of that older world. It is a phrase that does not make sense in the modern explanation, but makes perfect sense in the old one. The royals called themselves blue bloods because their actual blood was a different colour. The peasants called them blue bloods because everyone knew it. And when the bloodlines were finally diluted and the trait was lost, the phrase remained, attached to families that no longer had the biology that originally justified it. There is a reason the European royal families still obsess over their lineage. There is a reason they still keep marriage records that go back 1,000 years and more. There is a reason the actual ruling class of the world today, the families behind the banks and the corporations and the political dynasties, refuse to release their genealogies. They know what their ancestors were, they know what was lost, and they know that any honest examination of their origin would lead to questions that the modern system cannot afford to answer. Now let us look at the physical evidence that survived. Across Europe and across Asia, there are tombs that have been opened in the last 2 centuries that contain skeletons that do not match the standard human anatomy of the region. Tombs in northern Russia have produced remains that are 7 and 8 feet tall, with elongated skulls and unusually thick bone structure. The Russian archaeological community in the pre-Soviet period documented these remains carefully. After the Soviet takeover, most of the documentation was sealed or destroyed. The remains themselves, in many cases, were reburied or disappeared into private collections. The same pattern shows up in South America, in the Paracas region of Peru, where the elongated skulls became famous enough that even mainstream archaeology had to acknowledge them. The official explanation is cranial deformation, babies bound with boards. But genetic testing of some of the Paracas skulls has produced results that do not match any known human population. The mitochondrial DNA points to lineages that do not exist on the family tree of modern humanity. That research has been quietly buried by the academic establishment, but the samples still exist, and the people who did the original testing are still alive and still talking. These are not isolated finds, they are part of a global pattern. Wherever you look at the original ruling class of an ancient civilization, you find evidence of physical differences. Taller skeletons, different skull shapes, different blood chemistry in the cases where soft tissue survived long enough to be analyzed. The ruling class of the old world was not the same kind of being as the people they ruled. The chronicles said it openly, the archaeology supports it, and the official story refuses to acknowledge any of it. Consider the case of the catacombs beneath Paris. The official story is that they are simply old quarries repurposed in the late 1700s as a place to store the overflow of bones from the city cemeteries. That part of the story is true as far as it goes, but it does not explain why the quarries themselves are so vast, so structured, so deliberately engineered. They run for hundreds of kilometers under the city. The walls are dressed stone in many sections. There are chambers with ceiling heights that do not match anything you would find in a normal mining operation. And the bones, when they were sorted by the workers in the 1780s and 1790s, included a significant number of remains that did not fit standard human proportions. The workers were told to mix everything together and stack it by type. Femurs with femurs, skulls with skulls. Any anomalies were buried in the back, in chambers that are now sealed off and inaccessible to the public. The same thing happened in the catacombs of Rome, in the underground systems of Naples, in the cave networks under the great Anatolian cities. Wherever you find very old underground structures, you find anomalies in the remains. And wherever you find anomalies in the remains, you find a modern administration that has decided, for unstated reasons, that those particular chambers will not be open to researchers. There is a thread that runs through all of this, and it is worth pulling on. The thread is the deliberate erasure of evidence, not just the erasure of records, the erasure of physical remains. Bones disappear, tombs are sealed, photographs go missing, old maps are reclassified, encyclopedias are revised. Each individual case looks like an accident or a bureaucratic decision. Taken together, they form a pattern that no honest person can explain as coincidence. The pattern points back to the same conclusion. Someone or some group decided that the evidence of the older civilization had to be removed from public view. They were not able to remove all of it because there was too much. The buildings could not be hidden. The chronicles in the great libraries could not all be burned. The skulls in the museums could not all be reburied, but the system could make it difficult to connect the dots. It could classify the chronicles as superstition, the buildings as misdated, the skulls as deformities, and trust that most people would never bother to put the pieces together. Most people do not. That is the bet that the system makes, and it is usually a winning bet. The average citizen is too busy, too tired, too distracted by entertainment to spend their evenings digging through old archives. The system relies on this. The system depends on it, and every year, as the original sources get harder to find and the digital record becomes easier to manipulate, the bet gets safer. But there is a countercurrent. There are people who do dig, There are people who do read the old chronicles in the original languages. There are people who photograph the impossible buildings and compare the dates. There are people who track the bones and the maps and the missing decades in the official record. Those people have been building a parallel history for the last 20 or 30 years, mostly online, mostly outside the academic system. And that parallel history is starting to win. It is starting to win because the official story has too many holes. You can patch 1 or 2 holes, you cannot patch 1,000. And the more honest a person is, the more uncomfortable the official story becomes. There comes a point where you have to choose. Either you accept that the consensus history is broken, or you have to ignore so much evidence that you stop being a serious thinker. Most of the people in the academic system have chosen the second option. Most of the people watching this video have already chosen the first. Why does the official story refuse? Because the moment you accept that there were 2 different kinds of beings on this planet in recent history, you have to ask what happened to one of them. And the answer is uncomfortable. They were removed, systematically, by a faction that wanted the planet for itself. And that faction is still in charge. This is the part of the story that gets people called conspiracy theorists. So let us slow down and look at it carefully. The removal of the old ruling class did not happen because of popular revolt. That is the cover story. The French peasants did not actually storm the Bastille in a spontaneous uprising. The records of the time show that the revolution was planned, funded, and directed by a network of operatives who had been working on it for decades. The Jacobin clubs were not grassroots organizations. They were nodes in an organized structure. The same pattern shows up in the Russian Revolution, which was financed by banking interests in New York and London, a fact that is documented in primary sources but somehow never makes it into the textbooks. These revolutions were tools. They were used to remove specific bloodlines from power. And the bloodlines that were removed were always the older ones, the ones with the longer genealogies, the ones whose origins trace back to the northern homeland. The bloodlines that replaced them were newer. They did not have the same ancestry, they did not have the same biology, and they had no loyalty to the system that came before. By the early 1900s, the operation was essentially complete. The old houses were gone, the new houses were in place. The cities that the old world had built were now claimed by the new system, with new histories invented to explain how they got there. School children were taught that the great cathedrals had been built by medieval peasants with hand tools, that the impossible stonework of the Roman aqueducts had been done by slaves, that the megalithic structures of South America had been raised by people who had not yet invented the wheel. And nobody was supposed to notice that none of this made sense. The blue bloods, in the original meaning of the term, were gone. The phrase remained, but it now referred to a different group of families. Families who had taken the title without inheriting the biology. Families who pretended to be the continuation of something they had actually destroyed. This is why the modern royal families are mostly ceremonial. They have no real power. They are kept around as a symbol, a reminder that the old order is still nominally in place, while the actual power has moved somewhere else entirely. The British royal family, the Dutch royal family, the Scandinavian royal families, all of them are decorative now. The decisions are made in boardrooms and banks. The bloodlines that still carry titles are tolerated as long as they behave. The moment they step out of line, what happened to Diana happens to them. So where does this leave us? It leaves us with a planet whose real history has been hidden from us. A planet that was once ruled by a class of beings who were not the same as us, who built cities we cannot replicate, who had access to knowledge we no longer have, and who were removed in a coordinated operation that finished about 120 years ago. The system that took over has spent every year since then making sure that we cannot find our way back to that knowledge. The schools, the textbooks, the news, the entertainment, all of it is designed to keep us looking forward, never backward. Never asking what was there before, never asking what was lost. The phrase blue blood is one of the last cracks in the wall. It is a phrase the new system could not quite scrub out because it was too deeply embedded in the language. So they invented the pale skin explanation and hoped that nobody would dig further. Most people did not. Most people accepted the cover story and moved on. But the cover story has holes in it, and the holes are big enough to walk through. Once you walk through them, you cannot unsee what is on the other side. Look at the language itself for a moment. Across Europe, the phrase appears in almost every major language, with the same meaning in records that predate the Spanish nobility by centuries. Sangue blu in Italian, sang bleu in French, sangre azul in Spanish, Blaus Blut in German, Modra curve in the Slavic tongues. The phrase did not originate in any one country. It was already there when the modern European nations started writing their own histories, which means the concept it describes is older than the nations themselves, older than the languages in some sense. It belongs to the era before the rewrite. It is a survivor, and the survivors are how you find the truth. When a story is being deliberately rewritten, the rewriters cannot get everything. There are always fragments that slip through. A phrase here, a photograph there, a skull in a museum drawer that nobody got around to reclassifying, a map in a private collection that nobody got around to destroying. These fragments are the breadcrumbs. They lead back to the original picture. And the more breadcrumbs you collect, the clearer that picture becomes. There were two kinds of beings on this planet recently enough that the records still exist. One of them was removed, the other inherited the world, rewrote the history, and now runs the system you live in. The cities you walk through were built by the first group. The schools you went to were built by the second. The history you were taught was written by the second group about the first group after the first group was no longer around to defend itself. That is what the old world knew. That is what we forgot. And the work of remembering it piece by piece, building by building, chronicle by chronicle, is the work that still has to be done. If this video gave you something to think about, the rest of this channel is going to give you a lot more. Every video here is part of the same project. Putting back what was removed, restoring the timeline, showing you the world the way it actually was before the rewrite. The breadcrumbs are everywhere once you know how to look for them. The buildings are still standing, the chronicles are still readable, the maps are still in the archives, the skulls are still in the museums. None of it has gone away. It has just been mislabeled, misdated, and quietly moved to the back rooms. Our job is to pull it all back into the light, one piece at a time, until the picture is whole again and the world remembers what it used to know. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the next one. There is a lot of ground left to cover. And we are just getting started. There is much, much more that is still left to come.